come after. Kia ora tātou. Tēnā tātou katoa. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to this conference. Welcome to this event venue, no mai hara mai. Ke whakatakina ke ia tātou krakia hakapuare i tā tātou hui. Takina mai ngā manu o te rangi, karanga mai. Karanga mai e tāne ke mauri a koe ki tērā whenua, ki tērā moana, waiho atu ai. Mau e ki mai kia tā rāia mai he hoe, mau e ki mai kia tā rāia mai he waka kia pai e. Tū te tau i ihu, tū te tau rā, papatatai e, ake mana ko kūtau ki runga, ko mātau ki roro nei e, ko whakatau ana hei te toa tā maua whiti. Raua, tū mai te tō kia oi mai te tō kia haumi e, hui e, tai ki e. Tangi te keo e tū mai rā, whakamaharatanga atu kia rātou kua raume mene atu rā ki te pō. Ngā manu e tangi ana, patatoi ki ngai ui e hui mai nei. Te whanganui ātara ngā wai ripiropo e paripari mai rā. Te whenua o te Atiawa, te hunga papuri, te Māori, o tēnei rohe, te rohe o Taraika, te whanganui ātara. Tēnei ka mihi tātou e pai nei, tēnā kūtau, kia ora mai rā tātou katoa. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this conference. My name is Julian Wilcox, and unfortunately for you, I'm your master of ceremonies for the next 2 days, in this auspicious occasion, the Understanding Risk Forum here at Te Papa in the Oceania room here at this conference venue at Te Papa Tongarewa, New Zealand's National Museum. And as you know, this is a very significant event. It is the Wellington satellite of the Understanding Risk Forum that is being held over these next 2 days. It's a premier event for representatives from government, academia, international institutions and private sector in New Zealand and Asia Pacific to share knowledge on the latest developments and local perspectives in disaster risk management and climate change adaptation. And I was just talking to Dr. Dan Hikuroa about all of that as a part of a kaupapa that I'm researching at the moment on kupe, who has a lot of relevance here, and I can see one of my relations from the north here, Te Tamahine a Del Wihongi, the Y2624 and Fauna claim. Kupe is one of our founding ancestors of Aotearoa, New Zealand, a courageous navigator, a celestial navigator who made his way here to Wellington from the Pacific. And, depending on how far back you go, potentially all the way back to Asia. So it is right that we meet here in Wellington at Te Whanganui Ātara as the host satellite region for the Understanding Risk Forum being held over these next few days. Now, this is a hybrid event. The main location is actually in Brazil, plus smaller in-person satellite hubs in New Zealand, Nigeria, and in the UK, and a virtual participation option for all. So we are streaming live. This is being recorded as well, streaming live to the world. So for those of you who are joining us from our international hubs, we welcome you to Aotearoa, New Zealand. Nau mai, haere mai, and kia ora. Welcome to Aotearoa. The Wellington location provides an exceptional opportunity for the world to learn from New Zealand and vice versa, and strengthen the sustainable development agenda, moving from understanding risk to action on disaster resilience. Now, with that in mind, I think it's important that we have a full briefing on health and safety here at Te Papa at the Oceania room. So first of all, in case of an emergency, for example, if we have to evacuate, allow to evacuate this area, in case of an emergency for fire, the fire alarms will sound and they will be activated throughout the building, and we should all leave if we hear the fire alarms immediately. Egress is available from all floors and areas in the building via the marked emergency exits or by the main staircase. Te Papa Museum hosts will take full charge of the evacuation, so we will be guided to safety and they will ensure the building has been evacuated. Now, the assembly point is in front of Te Papa Tongarewa, near the Circa Theatre. So if you came in, when you came in the front door here at Te Papa, just on the left as you were coming in, you would have seen the Circa Theatre there. On Barnett Street corner, Cable Street next to Waitangi Park. The Te Papa hosts will advise all guests when the building has been cleared for re-entry. Ki te oru mai te whenua, ki te oru mai aru aumoko in case of an earthquake. Please stay away from the windows, as you know, find cover and remain there until all tremors have finished. Should the alarm go off during an earthquake, please remain under the shelter or in the venue and follow instructions again from the Te Papa Museum hosts or the emergency wardens. To protect the building from earthquake, the building sits, as some of you may know, on 150 base isolators. It will sway up to a half a metre, which is normal, and Te Papa is designed to withstand an 8.5 earthquake and is a designated civil defence centre. Te Papa will be one of the safer places here in Te Whangarui-Aotara in a major earthquake. Smoking, Te Papa Museum is a non-smoking environment. Smoking is only permitted outside the confines of the building and away from the main entrance doors. Ngā whare iti, ngā whare paku, the toilets, just head straight out of the Oceania rooms and then turn on the first left before the staircase and you'll see the signs for the whare paku there. Wi-Fi, always vitally important in a conference, I know. Details are printed at the top of your name tag. The Wi-Fi network is Tākina Events, and the password is events, all lowercase. Wi-Fi network, Tākina Events, password, events, all lowercase. I'm getting there, bear with, we won't be much longer. The event app and submitting questions, so you are able to submit questions for the presenters. Hopefully you've already had the opportunity to have a gander at the event app and downloaded that as well and installed the mobile app, as well as showing for the agenda over the next 2 days. The primary function of the app is to submit questions to presenters. To submit a question, go to Agenda, select the relevant session from the agenda, and then click Live Q&A. You can also connect with other attendees and exchange contact details in the app via the meeting hub. And if you've got any issues with the app, the team at the registration desk are there to help. If you pose a question, we'll make sure that gets up here. The more up likes it gets, the more thumbs up it gets, the more chance you'll have of the question being put to the presenter. Mobile phone etiquette, mehe me he waia pukoro tau I aia nei, moko naha hia te māngai o te kurina, which loosely translated means we hope you'll engage with the app and ask questions, but please respect the presenters and delegates by switching your mobile to silent during the sessions. Car parking, undercover car parking is available for guests at an additional cost of $25 per night, subject to availability. Guests must park in a car space with a hotel guest parking sign. Unauthorised parking may result in the vehicle being towed at the expense of the owner. So accept the owner's sorry, that's from my motel. What am I talking about? Sorry, that's for those who are staying at the Oaks. I've got a briefing for you. This is not for Te Papa. Now you know where I am, so if you're having trouble, come and find me. Anything else, health and safety-wise, come and ask any questions. Kabai? Any issues, just sing out or come and see me and we'll make sure we look after you. As I say, this is a very important event indeed with a wide range of speakers. So without further ado, I'd now like to introduce Peter Benfell, the acting CEO for GNS Science, who will deliver some opening remarks for us today. He's the interim CE at GNS Science, the New Zealand Crown Research Institute, and the country's leading provider of geoscience research and consultancy services. To make some opening remarks for the Understanding Risk Forum 2022, please make welcome the acting CEO for GNS Science, Peter Benfell. Homai hepakataki.
Atamare and Namai Haere Mai. Welcome to the Understanding Risk Forum 2022, and thank you, Julian, for that very fitting, really well done mihi whakatau. Thank you. So, just maybe just to start with, as I was standing at the back, it was delightful as people were coming in and chatting with some of you, just to see the enthusiasm, the keenness for people to be here for the event, and also the enthusiasm and energy about being together. It's really nice to experience, isn't it? And to be able to be together here today and connect. And I'm sure everybody's going to make the most of the opportunity over the next couple of days. Ko Peter Benfeld taku ingoa, and on behalf of Genius Science, it's my very special privilege to welcome you all here today. So thinking about risks and hazards, and what I want to start with first is just to go back to the recent 5.6 earthquake in West Java just a few days ago, which really brings the reality of what we're talking about and what we're all focused on home, doesn't it? Through our work in Indonesia with Genius Science, we had a large program, the acronym for it was STIRD, and it was a building resilience program where we came to know and work with a number of universities and local government agencies across Indonesia, including in Java. None of our close colleagues had friends or family that we know of that were affected by this tragic event in the last week or so, for which we're really grateful. STIRD was a multi-year NFAT-funded program aimed at strengthening Indonesia's resilience to the impacts of natural hazards. And I had the privilege of visiting Indonesia in the closing stages of the program in 2019 and witnessed firsthand how huge the task is to build resilience in the face of such a significantly growing population, a variety of security challenges, climate change, and almost daily occurrences of major natural hazard events. So in this sobering context, I genuinely want to acknowledge and thank you all for being here, for making the time and being part of this kōrero and participating today in spite of your busy environment and your competing priorities. Every 2 years, the Global Facility of Disaster Reduction and Recovery, managed by the World Bank, hosts a premier international event to discuss the world's latest research, innovations, and emerging ideas in disaster risk management. Here in Aotearoa, Genius Science, in partnership with Tokatu Ake EQC, has worked with the Understanding Risk Global Forum partners to bring their dialogue through into the Asia-Pacific region by hosting this satellite event here at Te Papa. With the world stage set in Brazil, hubs just like this one are also taking place in Niger, the UK, and we know in Canada now as well. These satellite events, combined with the virtual opportunities, are ensuring a wide global reach. Right here and now, we're offering, I think, an exceptional opportunity for the world to learn from New Zealand and for us to learn from our international friends. With technology and tenacity, this co-located hybrid forum gives every nation the opportunity to rise up and build on the sustainable development agenda, facilitating better understanding of risk and moving us with fortitude into action towards improved disaster resilience. Riding the waves of risk, that's the theme for the next 2 days. We'll explore this theme by focusing on climate and disaster risks in a multi-hazard world. We will be covering a raft of crunchy topics, including climate change adaptation, disaster resilience, the Indigenous perspective on risk, impact assessment, risk financing, and the welfare of psychosocial support aspects of emergency management. Gosh, that's quite a range of topics. We have an impressive agenda of speakers from New Zealand and Asia Pacific, all here to share their knowledge. We are joined by an exceptional community of policymakers, researchers, technology experts, students, entrepreneurs, and development partners. We're all here with one unified goal: to better understand our risks, to prevent disasters as best as we can, and to manage our way efficiently through hazard events. I'm really excited by the opportunities this forum offers us all and how together we can support the shared goal. At Genius Science, our vision is a cleaner, safer, and more prosperous New Zealand. But we could quite easily say that this could be New Zealand's national vision, couldn't we? We know Aotearoa is highly exposed to natural hazards, and we face unprecedented challenges from rapidly changing Earth systems. Recently, we've seen significant and permanently scarring earthquakes and eruptions, damaging floods, and prolific landslides. The effects of these natural hazard events, many of them irreversible, have galvanised major reforms aimed at to better adapt and improve resilience. Things like the Natural Hazards Insurance Bill and the Resource Management Reform. We know our future needs will be even greater and that meeting them will be even more challenging. Society's expectations on how we interact with natural processes and how we resource our long-term future requirements is also rapidly changing. And as the Crown Research Institute for Earth and Material Sciences, GNS Science is helping our nation navigate these significant global issues. Managing our increasing exposure to natural hazards is critical to our future well-being and prosperity, and GNS and New Zealand and the New Zealand science community, I think, are at the forefront of the effort in New Zealand. We lead or contribute to a large number of initiatives, including big research programs, things like the Resilience to Nature Challenge, the New Zealand Sea Rise program, Devora, Eclipse, Merit, Riscape, and the It's Our Fault program here in Wellington. We work increasingly on forecasting capability, modelling hazards to help decision makers build a safer future. We invest in state-of-the-art seismic monitoring, and along with our partner agencies, we're continually focused on mastering smart, rapid detection, delivering early warnings, and supporting effective national responses. We want our society to be empowered to live sustainably and resiliently in the face of the changes and challenges of the Earth and our environmental systems. Science holds the key to empowerment, but no one said it would be easy. I think it was Charles Schulz that said, in the book of life's questions, the answers are not in the back. It's our job to work out the answers to the key questions we're going to address over the next 2 days together. Questions like, how can we include Indigenous foundational concepts and perceptions of risk, resilience and adaptation to improve the resilience of vulnerable communities? What lessons can we learn from national action in the Pacific and New Zealand to better adapt to climate change? And how can we better quantify the impacts of natural hazards and climate change to help us plan and take action? We're here to learn from each other over the next 2 days. I hope that you find the discussion stimulating and enlightening, and we look forward to your active participation and valuable contribution. Thanks again to all of our speakers, to the organisers, and to each of you here for your generous gift of time. Aotearoa and our Asia-Pacific neighbours are richer for your support in navigating our hazardscape and future-proofing our world. Ngā mihi, and let's put our hands together, please, for the Understanding Risk 2022 Wellington. Thank you, and all the best for the next 2 days.
Thank you, Peter, for those opening remarks, and thank you to GNS Science as well for hosting this event over the next 2 days. And I've just noticed that your Māori name is Te Pūao, which, as Hema and I know, is the name of a kapahaka in the north. So we feel right at home, eh? Feel right at home. But Te Pūao, e mihi atu ana ki a koutou. Thank you again, Peter, for hosting the event here today. And as Peter has said, there are some extraordinary speakers that will be joining us over the next 2 days, not just for us in the room, but also because it's a hybrid event for those of us who are joining in virtually. It is great to have you with us. And I'll now move to introduce our first speaker. And, well, what more can be said about our first speaker that hasn't already been mispronounced by the Honourable Willie Jackson? Dan Hikuroa is... You'll get it, don't worry, we'll get to know each other over the next couple of days, you'll be fine. Dan Hikuroa employs earth systems and environmental humanities in his approaches, in his mahi and his work at Waipapa Taumatarau, the University of Auckland. He is an established world expert on weaving Indigenous knowledge and science to realise the dreams of the communities he works with. He is a UNESCO New Zealand Culture Commissioner, AGU Council member, and has key roles within New Zealand's science research sector. He's also reimagining and remembering relationships with water. Being a good ancestor is the topic of this presentation. It is reflective of a Māori way of understanding risk and resilience, underpinned by a worldview that sees people as interconnected with the land. This plenary will discuss some Indigenous foundational concepts and how they manifest as Indigenous perspectives of risk, resilience, and adaptation. As I said, speaking to the topic of being a good ancestor, please make welcome this descendant of Ngāti Maniapoto, Waikato Tainui, and Ngāti Whanaunga, Dr. Dan Hikuroa. E te taukuta tēnā koe.
Tēnā koe, kare. O, kia ora koutou katoa, ngā mihi o te ata. E hui mai nei. Me ki tuatahi he mihi kia koe, mō tō mihi whakatau i te tūwharatia te hui nei, tēnā koe, o te rā pira, mō tō kupu tautoko o te kaupapa nei, tēnā koutou katoa. Koutou katoa ko tai mai ki te whakarongo, ki roto i te ruma, me ki ngā tangata mo te ao whānui kei roto i te rorohiko, ki roto i te internet, me ki tēnā koutou katoa hoki. Ka pai, being a good ancestor. It might seem an unusual title for a talk at an understanding risk meeting where we're trying to explore what risk means, but I think it's actually highly illuminative and reflective of an Indigenous worldview. Being a good ancestor means that you actually have to be an ancestor. So there's actually a world for your offspring and their offspring to survive in and thrive in even. Being a good one means that you've also made those right decisions about your place and about the things that are good for your hapori, your community, your whānau family, hapu iwi, wider groupings. So being a good ancestor is as much about the practical things you do as it is about how you see your place in the world. You know, often you may have heard the saying, oh, this is, we're making decisions on behalf of our grandchildren's grandchildren. And being a good ancestor is a manifestation of that kind of thinking. But of course, as soon as you mention ancestor, we remember back to some of our ancestors. Julian has already mentioned an ancestor for many here today, kupe. And what that brings is not just a temporal element that's significant, but also a relational element about how we see ourselves in the world, about the decisions we make, about the things we do. And, of course, for how we understand risk, how we understand resilience, and how we understand adaptation. Now, I've received very clear instructions about how to use this, but I can almost guarantee I'll make a mistake somewhere. So, haere tonu. Ai, ko waitomo te awa, ko ōwhawhi te maunga, ko tuki kapu te marae. Ko Ngāti Uekaha te hapu, ko Ngāti Maniapoto te iwi, o tētahi o ngā iwi, ko tainui me te arawa ngā waka. Ko au e uri o Huturoa. Me tamata kapua me tia, ko Dan Hikuroa toko ingoa. So I've just introduced myself in a very Māori way, and in fact probably a very Indigenous way. Pepeha is what's often the term used for this way of introducing oneself. And it's also quite reflective of an Indigenous worldview and indeed a Maori worldview. You'll note that I'm listed at the very end of that list because I'm the least important of all of those things. All of those things existed before me. All of those things are part of my ancestry. And all those things hopefully will exist when I'm gone. Maybe even in a better place. And that's already starting to frame about what it means for me to be a good ancestor. About the decisions we make where we can understand the risk and we can manage for it and we can become more resilient in the things that we do. It's also very reflective of the Maori worldview, which is a relational one. We see ourselves as part of nature, which I think has already been mentioned by Julian, not apart from nature. And so our knowledge system is reflective of the way we see ourselves in the world. And that's really quite important when we start to understand, because we use terms like risk and resilience and hazards and vulnerability, and we have an understanding what they mean. But that understanding comes from a certain way of knowing and being and doing in the world. And it's not the only way of knowing and being and doing. So I'm going to share with you a Māori way and maybe some Indigenous ways of knowing and being and doing, and how that then informs how we understand risk, how we manage for risk, how we understand resilience and adaptation. And I'll specifically draw on Mātauranga Māori as we explore on this journey this morning. So Mātauranga Māori is a topic, it's more than a topic, it's a way of knowing, and it's a way of being, and it's a way of doing, an epistemology, an ontology, and an axiology. It's inclusive of Māori knowledge, the culture, the values, and the worldview. And I include those intentionally because other forms of knowledge don't include all of those. And this isn't about a contest on which is right and which is wrong. It's just to be very clear that Mātauranga Māori definitely includes values, worldview, and culture. When we often think about Mātauranga Māori, because Māori culture was an oral tradition, we often think of those rich oratory as the sources of Mātauranga, of pūrākau, of our encoded narratives, of maramataka, of those practices that are taught in court as we work through things, of waiata, songs, of mōtiiti, of chants, of whaikorero, and in the way in which knowledge was passed down through the generations. But we also have more tangible forms of mātauranga, and I've chosen this image of umutahi whare as part of umutahi marae. Now I need a quick disclaimer here. I do not whakapapa to this marae. I do not trace my ancestry to this marae in a DNA kind of sense, but I have a connection with this marae. I've spent over 3 years, probably good 2 or 3 weeks staying on this marae, undertaking some rangahau within and for the community. And they've given me permission to share and use this image for these kinds of purposes, teaching, learning, and research. And so this image shows a whare, and of course there's knowledge that's encoded within that whare in the design. It's unmistakably a whare. You could go anywhere in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and even though the dimensions and the carvings will change, that's unmistakably a whare. And so that's knowledge that's in the design of that. And then there's knowledge in the materials we use to build our whare. Different timbers had different qualities. And so you'd use certain timbers for the maihi, for the carvings. You'd use certain timbers for the pautoko manua, the strong central posts. And then you might use other timbers with different qualities for the tāhuhu, the backbone. None of these were by random. All of these were by design and choice. Some of those ones for the outer exterior were more resistant to weathering. Others inside were sometimes selected from certain sides of hills where there was more wind. And so there was a wind loading on that tree, and that tree was hence always growing in the presence of that wind. And so it's got a pre-stress tension built into it. And so it was much better suited for certain purposes. I've seen a couple of engineers in the room, and you probably understand what I'm talking about. That's by design, that's knowledge. And then we have the colour schemes. Look, let's be honest, that's probably just Resine's red and, I don't know, Levine's white nowadays. But those colours are our traditional colours. Those colours are the colours of Papa Tuanuku. We have our reds. Umutahi marae is in Matata, just in the Waiariki area, maybe just out of that, in an area with lots of geothermal activity. And so all 3 of those colours we can find in geothermal areas. For those who aren't blessed with some of those geothermal taonga, we can actually generate those red ochres. If those from the Auckland region, you might know some of the sedimentary rocks that you find in places like Takapuna and St Heliers and that. If you go to certain layers within those strata and you find rocks that are a little bit sandy with a little bit of yellow staining, you can take them and you can put them in a fire. Some people like to splash seawater on them at a time, and then they'll turn that beautiful red. The chemists in the room will know, that's just oxidising iron. But that's knowledge that was used in order to make and create those ochres and those dyes. So there's colours, and then there's the carving. So there's both the knowledge of the carver as someone who knows how to work with a medium and can create things, and then there's the knowledge of the carvings. I think those are extraordinarily beautiful. That's my view. They're also depicting real people. If you know how to read this, it tells you the entire whakapapa and history of Umatahi, the tribe, the hapu of this area. And so there's knowledge both of the carver and there's knowledge in the carvings. And one last aspect, and I'll loop back to this a little bit later on in the presentation, is there is knowledge determined in where to build. This marae used to be somewhere else. And because of a certain event, it was determined that they needed to shift it to keep it safe. So they shifted it to its current location. And we'll talk about its current location and its relevance with respect to understanding risk and understanding resilience as we get a little bit further through. But importantly, and I mentioned earlier, this idea of worldview. And we all have one. We all have something that sits in our minds tells us about what's actual, what's probable, what's real, what's impossible. Every single one of us has one, and there is a very dominant worldview in Aotearoa, New Zealand. It's become so dominant that you kind of don't even really notice it or see it because it's the worldview that most people have. But it's important to recognise that we have one. And that if we have one, the person next to us will have one. And often that one will be very similar. But in some instances, their one might be a little bit different or quite different. And I'll be very clear, my purpose today is not to try and get you to change your worldview. My purpose is to show that you have a worldview and show you that your worldview is actually really powerful at conscious levels and at subconscious levels when it starts to come to understand and determine what is at risk, what is vulnerable, what is a hazard. So what does it mean actually? Well, maybe I'll try and use an image. Remember that time? Actually, I had on good authority lately that in some places that's still real, but I think enough said about that, the better. This was believed. This was real. Now, with improved technology and information, we're now pretty confident that Earth is a spherical structure. It's kind of spinning around and it's going around some other things, and so that's no longer really the reality. But for a long, long time, the world was believed to be flat. So here's another example, a little bit more cryptic. I use this one in class a lot, and I try and get interactive. It might be a bit challenging, this environment. So I'm going to ask some questions, and I'm going to give you some typical answers that I receive. So I asked the question, what is this? It's usually followed with really puzzled looks and kind of, it's a whale? Thinking it's a trick question. Not a trick question, absolutely. A whale is one way that we can describe this. And then sometimes people who know their whales will say, that's a humpback whale. Oh, nice, that's lovely. And then occasionally we have someone who really knows their stuff, and they'll give the Linnaean classification for this whale. For those of you that know Latin, it's a large-winged New Englander, Meregaptera nervangliae. Large-winged on account of its pectoral fins being large relative to its cetacean cousins, and New Englander because it was described for the first time of populations known off the coasts of New England, despite the fact that this occurs all around the world. And then if you start to think in the kind of, this is a talk on Indigenous knowledge, some people might say, I know a Māori word for whale. Tohora is a word I've heard people talk about for whale, or ikanui, or parawa. And all of these are names for whales. And there's another word actually for whale, which some people volunteer when I come to question time. They say, paikea. And for some iwi on the east coast of the North Island, paikea is their name for this species of whale. It's also a name for one of their ancestors who is closely associated and linked with humpback whales. And there are a few versions on that. That's not really my story to tell, but anyone who's seen the movie Whale Rider will be familiar with what I'm talking about. Much to my kind of regret that the actual whale they depicted in the movie was not the humpback whale. Hei wanoa, that's another raru for another day. The key thing to recognise is that in all of those descriptors of what we're talking about there, we're looking at the same thing, but we're relating to it differently. And our relation to it is dependent on our worldview. For some people, that's an ancestor. For some people, that's a majestic creature. For some people, if that washed up on the beach, that would be a windfall. That would be kai for days. So the important thing there is that the question about who is right and who is wrong is not really helpful. The question is, how many ways can we relate to this thing here? And so that's what I'm going to ask you to think about. How do we relate to risk? How do we define risk? How do we relate to resilience? How do we define resilience? And it's all dependent on our worldview. Here's another example. And I paused there because I'm hoping that the pedagogy of learning meant that your brain went something like this. Oopsie daisy, his image has been inverted. Poor fella, he's up there trying to give a keynote and this has happened to his presentation. Oh no, actually the words are up the right way. Okay, something interesting is going on here. Our brains instantly recognise the pattern. Our brains are really, really good at recognising patterns. And then we see the words. So I have simply put this image up and privileged a Maori worldview based around ngā pūrākau a Māui, and in particular Te Ika a Māui. Some of you may know, many of you may know about the kōrero of Māui when he fished up the North Island of New Zealand, and then his canoe foundered on a shallow reef and became the South Island, and of course the North Island is Te Ika a Māui. And I've aligned it this way because the head of Te Ika a Māui, Te Upoko o Te Ika a Māui, is this region right here. And so human condition is when we think about things with heads, often we think about them with the heads oriented upwards because that's how we walk and how we operate. I've actually been thinking maybe I should have it like that because when I think about fish, I usually think about them swimming horizontally. Hei o no, the point remains, this is still clearly a map of New Zealand, but I've just aligned it consistent with a Māori worldview. Now, our worldview is actually really, really strong and operates at those different levels. How many of you have kind of had found yourself in a situation where you'll be looking at something or thinking about something, you thought, I couldn't believe my eyes? You know, I've had a moment like that a couple of years ago where I was leading a field trip with some students, and we've been talking about mātauranga, and we've been talking about science, and we're talking about the interaction and the weaving, and the similarities and the differences, and we were staying at a lodge on Whakapapa. And these students had all come down from the US, and so we said, oh look, the night sky is really clear tonight. It had been cloudy the first few days. Let's go outside and have a look at the night sky. And I want you to think about what you recognise, consistent with this image about what you recognise, but might be kind of up the other way compared to the way you're used to seeing it, as well as anything new that you might see that you've never seen before. Oh, and by the way, look out for satellites. I've always looked for satellites. I'm a bit of a geek like that. And they said, oh, what do satellites look like? I said, they look just like a star, but you know, they'll actually be moving kind of slowly across the night sky on a nice kind of trajectory. Okay, they said, and some eager ones raced out, and I was just picking up some conversations with a few other students as we were making our way out. And then I heard someone yell out, hey, there's a satellite, and another one, and another one, and another one, and another one. And although I didn't really think about it clearly at the time, I reflected on this, you know, just later that evening. I remember thinking, oh, in all my years of looking for satellites, I've never seen that many all at once. They're obviously getting confused with something else. Well, e hikama. Out we go, and look, there it is, right across the night sky. 27 satellites, all in a row, all tracking at the same speed, across in the same line. And I can tell you, for a few seconds, I could not believe my eyes. And the reason was, there's nothing wrong with my eyes. My eyes were working perfectly fine. It's that my brain and my worldview was telling my eyes, you can't be seeing that because that's not possible. That's not within the realms of what you believe to be real or possible. Of course, a quick Google search and it was jolly Elon Musk. There was a very, logical and rational reason for us seeing this. But it was a really important lesson to me. It showed me that my worldview was so strong, it was willing to tell me my eyes weren't working properly. And so sometimes in the work I do, I need to stop sometimes. When I find myself seriously challenged by something, I can't believe that. I need to think, maybe it's my worldview that's stopping me from understanding that. Maybe I need to pause and think about, talk to me about your worldview. What's real to you? how do you understand this phenomena? How do you understand this thing we're talking about? So, within that worldview, a Maori worldview sees that everything we see on earth and we see in the skies is connected in a kinship-based relationship through the primal parents, rangi and papa. Everything we see ultimately came from them. Now, I know I'm being a little bit... I'm shortening down the whakapapa for those of you in the room who know there are longer ones. For the interest of time, we'll just start with rangi and papa. Some of our whakapapa of creation go a little bit back further, in fact, most of them. But the key thing is everything we see came from rangi and papa, Sky Father and Earth Mother. And that's a way of making sense of the world, and that's the way that we frame up our knowledge. We try to look for how things are similar to one another and how they relate to one another. Yes, we understand that things have their own sense, but it's about how they relate to one another, which is more important for us. Kapai. Okay, so with all that in mind, now we'll start jumping in and talking about hazards and risks. Look, I did have a little bit of a formatting thing there. I'll just get through to all of these. Kapai. So, I trained as a geologist. And we were taught to understand the world this way. These were the important questions that we have when it comes to these ideas of risks and hazards. And we want to know, what are the things that might be hazardous to us? How often do they occur? How big are they? We just heard, about an earthquake, a 5.6 that had some disastrous effects for some folks up in Indonesia. And we want to think about, how vulnerable are we to these events, and how resilient are we to these events? And there's a very simplistic equation, and I know there'll be those of you in the room who go, oh my gosh, he's going back to that and archaic kind of antiquated way of thinking about it. But it's a helpful way to get us to understand that our worldview is already at play when we start to think about those words, hazards, vulnerability, and risk. So, you have your hazard. You have an earthquake. You have your vulnerability. Is there a city there? Is there a port there? Are there people there? And then you get your risk factor. I think most of you would be relatively comfortable with that framing. So I'm not going to talk too much about science today because a lot of the work in hazards and risk in the science space is all about trying to answer those questions. Instead, I'm going to jump straight into Indigenous knowledge. And if you see IK, that's just a short-term acronym for Indigenous knowledge. Here's the first thing. Mātauranga Māori can include information that's codified that records hazard events. And so Mātauranga Māori, that state of knowing or the knowledge or the cognizance of something is inclusive of a method for generating knowledge and all the method generated using that all of the knowledge generated using that method, and within Mātauranga Māori, there is a suite of techniques that are empirical in nature for investigating phenomena, for acquiring new knowledge, for updating and integrating previous knowledge. And it comprises systematic observation, sometimes measurement and experimentation, but usually with the body as a system of observation and the body and the recognition of the measurement. And in the science language, some of that knowledge system is about forming a hypothesis. We predict that this might happen. And the testing of that hypothesis. For example, the maramataka, the Māori calendar, predicts certain things will happen. And we can look to see if they happen or not. And then, of course, the ability to modify those hypotheses or those predictions should the observation base change. So here's just a few examples of Indigenous knowledge as a codified database of hazards. Really interestingly, and I'll just talk about the first one here briefly, Don Swanson and others who are working at the Hawaii Volcano Observatory had logged all the eruptive episodes around Kilauea. They had a beautiful map and they talked about the eruptions. And then they learnt of this old tradition that describes 400 years of volcanic activity. And when they put those two next to one another, one set of knowledge had more eruptions in it than the other. The oral history record had more eruptions in it than the geologist had recorded in the field. And so they said, oh, that's interesting. let's investigate it a bit more clearly. And so they got in, and some of that old tradition would talk about a particular battle that Pele would have with a sister or a cousin or tangaroa, and it had some geographic elements to it. And so using that, they went looking for the missing eruptive episodes. Who thinks they found them? Who knows they found them? And that's a really interesting mind bend there too, isn't it? Because we assume that the written record in science is a more accurate method of storing information through time. Yet an oral tradition was able to do that just as easily. Well, maybe not just as easily. There are certain people who are picked who can retain that knowledge. The key thing there is that it's a database we can rely on. It's a database of actual events that occurred, and it's codified consistent with that Indigenous worldview. So now as we start to think about, what actually is a hazard, what actually is a disaster. And traditionally human life was valued very differently. Infrastructure was valued quite differently as well. Somewhat similarly, but also a little bit differently. So what, therefore, would a disaster entail? And one framing was that the real calamity was the loss of mana. Mana meaning, we haven't got all day, or all week even. In this instance, mana meaning kind of prestige or authority, or I'll leave it at those two actually. So you would have a loss of mana. What does that look like? If you lost a chief, a person within whom the tribe and whose successive manifestations of the tribe had invested information and time and what might, leadership skills. And so if you lost a chief, that was a significant loss of mana. But if you lost some of the folks who weren't as important and didn't have as much information that was important for the well-being of the entire group, there would be a loss of mana, but not as much loss of mana. Now, I need to be clear, this isn't something I'm saying we need to go back to. This is just saying how risk was understood traditionally. And disasters were caused by things against, sometimes a thing would happen and it would be that someone had upset some of the deities, some of the atua. Or sometimes you might have had a little bit of some tohunga or some ariki with some strong powers. Tohunga, once again, trying to translate is tricky. Those who had very, very strong understanding of the taiao. One understanding I've heard of tohunga is tohu are the indicators of the signs that we see in the taiao, and a tohunga was someone who knew how to read and interpret and sometimes invoke some of those signs. Or these disasters were caused by taniwha. And taniwha being often associated with water creatures that bring with them a sense of danger, of alarm, of beware. And actually, disasters weren't so much caused by taniwha, but with a manifestation of taniwha. Look, and I'll just give you one quick example, just checking for time, I think we're still good. Some of you may recall that there was a headline a few years ago now about a piece of highway that was being built down near Rangiriri, just south of Auckland, where a headline read something along the lines of, mythical creature costs taxpayer millions of dollars, and it spoke about a taniwha called Karutahi who dwelt in a certain area, or who had a lair in a certain area, which is where the motorway was supposed to be going straight through. And for whatever reason, the planners had determined that they would just alter the course of that motorway slightly so that they wouldn't be going across the lair of Karutahi. And so it kind of, was a bit of a furore, and then it kind of, died down. It was about 14 or 16 months after the completion of the highway, the motorway there, just a massive flood completely wiped out the exact area where the motorway was supposed to go. And this imaginary discussion in my mind takes place, where at the peak of the flood, the local hapu would point out to the traffic planners and engineers, "Karutahi." And the engineers and the planners would say, "What didn't you mean flood risk?" And they say, "Well, that's not how we understand it." And hey or no, I've still yet to see the headline which says, mythical creature saves taxpayers millions of dollars, but maybe that might come one day. And despite the view that these disasters were caused by tohunga or ariki or taniwha, because Indigenous knowledge is dynamic, a hazard management response can also be a fast response. And so when something like this eruption happened, people didn't wait to see what civil defence were going to say. They didn't wait to say what, is the Wi-Fi going? Is the radio going? Even though populations living there at the time in 1886 when this erupted had never witnessed an eruption, within their encoded knowledge, events like this had occurred, and they knew when that thing goes, you just got to pack up and leave. And so families who were aware of this knowledge, just that fast response. So they understood about the risk and they managed it. They made their own decisions because they were aware of this. Even though they'd never seen an eruption from Tarawera, they were able to take instant response. There's also another aspect that I'll bring in really quickly, and that's the role of marae in these post-disaster responses. And of course, marae I showed one a little bit earlier. We had the marae of Umatahi. And just to try and highlight this example, in 2005, in fact, let's go back to 2004. In 2004, in this general region, and this is the Bay of Plenty, there were flash floods. Mainly they impacted over on the Manawatu. That's where we had some massive floods in 2004. And in fact, probably some of you are thinking, oh, those are nothing compared to the ones we've seen more recently, and that's true. But then in 2005, we had some more significant weather events, and we had flash floods along this area of the Bay of Plenty, including two that smashed into Matata. This image shows, there's a pointer here. This image shows this house here used to be up here, and this house was about there, and that's the main road. For those of you that know Matata and the Bay of Plenty, that was where the road went through. And this is the rail bridge. So a significant amount of sediment and trees smashed down into Matata. Just around the corner is another stream, the Waitapuru stream, and that will come up in another kōrero lately. But when I say to you, remember that image of the debris flows, this is the image I want you to remember. And so when that happened, this marae, just around the corner from that, people went over there and stopped off and were sheltered. And so marae are places that can cater for people, large numbers of people at short notice. They can cater for your physical needs. And as we discover, what's really important, particularly post-Christchurch, is that physical needs aren't just enough. Sometimes you actually need your emotional and your spiritual needs taken care of as well. And marae are perfectly suited for that because, of course, the whare like this is the manifestation of an ancestor of that group of people. So you're sleeping inside the ancestor, and all of those that are his uri or her uri, who their offspring, are also there to give you that protection and that well-being. Okay, I've spent far too long storytelling, so I'm just going to ramp things on a little bit. How much more time do I have? 10? Okay. Kapai. So, yeah, these are some of the characteristics of marae. Large numbers of people, speedy mobilisation. Often, this is a little bit sad really, for many of us, the main time we go back to our marae or visit marae is when there's either been a tangi or whether there's a marquee birthday or a wedding or a celebration. Sadly, it's tangi or funerals that we most often go for. And just like hazard events, those aren't planned, eh? They just kind of happen. Yet our marae are well set up and can be instantly mobilised with just a few phone calls. And the appropriate site is an interesting one. So here's that image. In fact, I put it in there so you can remember. Umatahi marae is built next to that other stream I mentioned, Waitapuru stream. And there is a kōrero, there is a pūrākau, an oral narrative that talks about a taniwha that resides in the Waitapuru stream. And just to give you an idea of the geography of this area, we have the lowland, low-lying Rangitaiki plains there. And then we have the steep uplifted blocks. For those technical folks in the room, that's a Horst and Graben structure. And so you've got some geography, some topography there. And so the lizard, which is in the stream which is in that direction, the Waitapuru stream, the taniwhara in this instance is manifest as a lizard. And its head is up on the headwaters of the stream, and its arms and legs run off orthogonal to the body. And as the body comes down, and as the stream exits that uplifted block out onto the plains, that's where the tail of the ngarara, of that lizard, starts. And the beware aspect of this particular taniwhara is beware the flicking tail of the ngarara, beware the flicking tail of the lizard. So if I just looked at that as a scientist and tried to interpret that as evidence or as risk, I'd go looking for a lizard in a stream that's about 3 or 4 k's long, and I'd say, doesn't compute. I'd look for a tail of something, and I'd say, I can't even see a lizard, so I just rule that to be false at that point. However, I'm trying to explain it using the wrong worldview. What we actually have is some descriptions and a firm understanding of the geomorphology of that particular stream. As it cut down through that uplifted block, there is a sinuosity to it, just like we see in lizards. And the arms and legs run off more or less orthogonal, or the tributaries run off more or less orthogonal to that stream. And then as the tail starts, as the stream exits and goes on to the low-lying areas, any of you who have looked at kind of LiDAR imagery or DEM imagery will know that at a flood delta or delta like that coming out of a stream, in flooding events, the channel will often avulse and form a new channel and build up the banks, and then it'll go to the low side. And if you took a time-lapse photograph through time of that stream when it came out, you would see that the channel shifts over and back and forth just like the flicking tail of a lizard. Now, sadly, that information wasn't passed on to the town planners of Matata, and so houses near where the Waitapuru stream were impacted. But Umatahi Marae, which is only some couple of hundred metres away from the area where the tail flicks, was not impacted during that flood event. So you recall that marae used to be somewhere else, and it was shifted here. And I have absolutely no doubt in my mind that it was put in that precise location because it was out of the area in which the tail flicked. So it's in a safe site. The risk was understood, and that pūrākau of that taniwha contained both the evidence and the policy for managing risk, and therefore increasing resilience for that particular community. And then when the disaster does happen, the marae is still safe. So then we can start to deal with the resilience at that point. And an Indigenous worldview brings the idea that change is the only constant. And change will occur, but it doesn't prescribe when it will occur. It anticipates that it will, and then it can incorporate what new realities might be when that change occurs. But there is no surprise when this happens. So when these things happen, it's not about nature's trying to get me. It's just a manifestation of the atua. It's a manifestation of the taniwha, or those kind of things. What's also really interesting is that some iwi relate very strongly with their maunga, with their mountains. And some of those maunga happen to be active and erupt from time to time. And some of the framing used to be that you would have the hazard, i.e. the volcano, and then you times that by the vulnerability and you get your risk. But when some iwi saw that maunga was their ancestor, and it's been described as a hazard, they felt an unease at that point. And so I know some of the language at that point, some of the language we use now has changed. But what's really interesting when we think about it from a risk perspective is, they knew that place erupted, and they used to speak about, these maungas being koro or granddad. Granddad got grumpy sometimes, or koro got grumpy sometimes. But we knew that, and so you just build your infrastructure out of harm's way. You wouldn't build it in the valleys where you might get lahars, and you'd hopefully build it kind of far enough that you wouldn't get impacted by the ash. Now, the basis of that can only be on your understanding of the eruptions that have been witnessed. I recognise the limitations of that with respect to, say, the ignimbrite forming explosive rhyolite eruptions that we have in the Taupo zone that might impact far more widely than some of those more small eruptions we see on the andesite cones. But the point remains is that there is a different framing around what a hazard meant, and therefore that gave us different framings around what risk meant. And ultimately, I think, we've never had this conversation, but they reduced their vulnerability. They reduced their vulnerability, to the point that it was almost zero for the eruptions that had been seen by them and their ancestors. Does that make sense? Ka pai. Okay, so another form, and I'm just looking for Nicolas here to make sure I give some time for kōrero and questions. We're still in good shape. Another form of knowledge which I think is really helpful for understanding risk, because it's a predictive part of it, is the maramataka. And the maramataka is the Māori lunar calendar. It operates when we have a new moon, which is counterintuitively when there's no moon in the sky. It goes up to when it's full, and then it wanes again to when there's nothing, and that's one lunar cycle, that's one marama. The maramataka breaks down each of those nights and the corresponding days, and primarily it serves as a thing for marking time. We also use it for marking seasons, although I have a little bit of a challenge with this particular manifestation of the seasons, because it's put a certain worldview into what the seasons should be. Not all maramataka have the 4 seasons like we have in this one. The maramataka that I've learnt the most from, and this is from the rangatira, the Tōhunga Reriata Makiha, and he talks about the Ngāti Whātua Ki Kaipara maramataka. They only had raumati and takurua. They only had a summer and winter season aspect. But within those, there were different phases. So for summer, Matua Reriata talks about there being 8 phases of summer. And for any of you who might kind of recall, oh gosh, I remember that long, hot summer, went forever, that would be the kind of summer where you would have those full 8 phases. But for some of you that remembered when your tent got ruined and it rained and it was a hōhae summer holiday, that would have been a summer when there might have only been 5 or 6 phases of summer. And so the importance here is that we actually rely on the natural systems to tell us what the seasons are and when the seasons should be, rather than trying to prescribe when they should be using an artificial time frame that instead favours how long it takes for us to go around the sun, as opposed to how many or how long it takes for us to go through a lunar phase. I'm being clear, neither one is wrong. I'm just saying one is used here and one is used there. And so that's saying, summer came early this year or winter was late. That would never happen according to the maramataka, because you have different signs. And usually there would be 3, a tohu o te rangi, tohu o te whenua, and tohu o te moana. A sign in the skies, a sign in the land, and a sign in the oceans. And once all of those 3 had occurred, usually a tohu o te rangi might be the star for that month, or a group of stars for that month. Then you might see a flower appear, and then you might see the humpback whales come back down on their return. And a certain season has just started. Okay. And so within the maramataka, it gets quite prescriptive around certain things that you might be better suited to do during that month. And so this is a general one for the month, and then that will, general one for any month, and that might change a little bit in detail for a particular month, and then it might change a little bit also for the particular seasons. The key thing here about understanding this was based on empirical observations made through centuries of living with the systems. Now, also to be clear, that this was less about, maybe put it the other way, this is more about probabilities. So most of you will have heard of the Maori fishing calendar, where it says today's excellent fishing or terrible fishing or something else. And so if you went out fishing on a day when it said excellent and you got nothing, you'd be going, oh, those jolly Māori, they didn't know a jolly thing about fishing. What's missing when you get that in the newspaper is they would say, on this group of days, in this month, if you go to that place, use that technique, at that time of the day, you'll catch that kind of fish. That's the level of detail that's missing out of the maramataka when we just get excellent or moderate or poor. And it also doesn't mean that if you go fishing on a day when it says terrible that you won't catch fish. It just means that on the days where it's good, there's an increased likelihood of that happening. And so the maramataka is already noticing changes when things flower. It's already noticing changes in when things happen in the oceans. And I think with respect to risk and resilience, this is going to be one of the ways in which we can start to notice and understand risk and account for it when it starts to be the new reality. And the neat thing about the maramataka was that it's not fixed or static. It is dynamic, and it can anticipate change. And it was taught to the next generation. It was probably more caught by the next generation. You learnt it by doing it. But within those close observations of the tire, of the environment, and anticipating when things would happen, and then seeing when things change, it's a way of managing risk. It's a different kind of risk. It's about ensuring that you get kai when things could happen. But I think that's going to be a powerful way for us to understand the risk and the resilience and the adaptation. So in summary, I think the Māori superpower is about being a good ancestor when it comes to understanding risk, because it forces us to think about those other ways of knowing and being and doing, and it gives us an opportunity to bring in mātauranga. Much mātauranga, I would argue, for this understanding risk and resilience, brings an accuracy that we can't always get with our science. Science can be very precise, but we may lack that accuracy. And just to give one example, and this isn't to pick on my colleagues who actually who are GNS employees, following those flash floods in Matata in 2005, they came in and did a week's worth of amazing work, and they produced some reports, and they said, hey, this is where we think's happened, this is where we think how much sediment's come down, this is how long we think it's going to be until you can build up enough sediment in those rivers and streams again to form a similar magnitude debris flow based on the same rainfall. Through just a combination of unique geology and a few things, we worked out that wasn't quite true. And it's not because they're bad scientists, it was because some of the assumptions they made didn't quite hold up, and it was because we sat with the locals and they told us about the histories and they told us about certain events. And so we were able to work with them to show that, the way about being a good ancestor and encoding your risk management was a way to ensuring that you were more resilient and could therefore adapt in the future. Nō reira, kia ora mai tātou katoa.
Awesome. Cheer, bro. Me. That was awesome. So what we have got time for some questions, about a quarter of an hour. So I'll get you, for those in the room who want to ask questions, or even those joining us virtually, please log your questions and we'll wait for some of them to come up on the app here. I've just got a couple to kick us off, if that's okay, Dr. Hikuroa. First of all, thank you for the acknowledgements of a couple of key people in your research, in particular Matuarira Tamakiha, but also those communities that you've worked with. Matatai, you talked about Christchurch. I think it's interesting when you go down to Christchurch City, have a look at the traditional marae of Ngaito. None of them are in the city, right? They're all built out of tuahiwi or rāpaki or koukourarata, which is kind of interesting. So the first question I have is, what are the significant challenges to applying Indigenous knowledge and understanding risk?
Yeah, kia ora, kare. And that's why it took so long on Worldview. I think the biggest challenge is the limitations that worldviews can bring. If you try and interpret certain information or understand certain information, but don't try and understand it from that worldview, then it can be misinterpreted. And so the example I gave of, going to look for a lizard that's 3 kilometres long with a flicking tail, if I just used my science framing from that would be proved false just like that. I wouldn't even have to go. However, when we shift worldviews and say, what are they actually talking about there? Maybe this is a codification of knowledge in a way that made sense to people that actually is based on empirical observations. And those empirical observations can inform us about what might be at risk. And therefore our management decisions can flow from there.
And again, I encourage anyone to ask questions. We've got a microphone at the back, so if you want to ask a question of Dr. Hikuroa, there's a microphone over here, so just raise your hand when you're ready. Another question that I had was, what can be done to strengthen the application of Indigenous knowledge and understanding risk? Because as you know, there's very few Te Reo Makihas around.
Ai tika tau. I think one of the ways that we can do it is to really bring to our understanding or bring to the table when we start to engage with these different ways of knowing and being and doing, people who know it and people who can weave between those two knowledge systems. One place where we're trying to do that is at Te Manarohi Taio, the Environmental Protection Authority, where we recognise that much knowledge was being given as evidence, and we do have risk there. We've got we analyse the risk of hazardous substances and new organisms when they come to Aotearoa, New Zealand, but we recognised that it was only science that was being used in the decision making, and so we devised a mātauranga framework which enabled us to determine the veracity of mātauranga, but from a Maori worldview, because we need to be careful of people who might cry taniwha. We need to have a system that can probe into it enough so that we can be confident that actually, yes, this taniwha comes from a tradition of living in that place and understanding that, it might manifest itself as a strong tidal current or as a paleo a tsunami event that's a result of an earthquake. All of those are examples that are actual real examples.
We've got one from Richard here. Thank you, Richard, who I think has joined us virtually for using the app and posting the question. So the question is Indigenous knowledge being lost with reduction of oral tradition?
The short answer is yes, and we have lost a lot already. What's exciting, though, is that there are more and more people who are going back to these communities and saying, hey, within your mātauranga, there might be really important stuff that we can use to try and make your urupa safer, to make your marae safer, as well as maybe make the more general community safer in it. Because one of the important things is that when you've lived and your experience and your ancestors' experience has been that your knowledge is not valid, is not relevant, and decisions have been actively made to determine that if you practiced it, it was against the law, it was intentionally lost for some people. My grandparents chose to not teach my parents te reo, or my father te reo. They were making a decision at the best interests of their children at the time. So, yes, it's being lost, but the exciting thing now is like working with people like Matua Reriata, is to try and say, hey, this isn't just a Google-type knowledge. We need to start generating new knowledge, using our old techniques, making our observations and updating the maramataka and updating the things. To me, that's where the really exciting thing. So yes, we're starting with a much reduced body of knowledge, but we are starting to grow it again.
Beautiful. I wonder if you could give us an example of the application of maramataka, an example that you've seen where risk was mitigated or managed. I'll tell you a story. In the weekend, we had a wānanga. It started on Friday, finished on Sunday. I won't tell you where we had the wānanga because Hema knows where it is. But it begins with W and ends in A, and in the middle is I'm. Anyway, we were going to go up the river on the Friday. And the Friday was a tīrea day, I think, on the maramataka. Sorry if I'm going too deep, but anyway, you'll get there. It was a tīrea day. Matua Rerata said, no, we're not going up the river that day. And I said, why not? By the way, this was a month and a half out, right? And he goes, no, we're not going up the river that day. No, good. I said, hey, do you know? He said, well, high tide will be 10. He said, the weather prediction's not that great anyway, but it's a tīrea day. Next day is ohoata. We'll go on the next day. High tide will be 10:30, 11. We need to get on the rawene, on the boat at rawene. We hired a boat. Get at the harbour at 10:45. It'll be high tide. It'll take us up the river. We'll go out for an hour and a half. Tide will turn. We'll come back on the outgoing tide. Did exactly all that, right? Came back, beautiful day. Next day, pouring down with rain. Friday, pouring down with rain. So is there another example that you can give of that application that you've seen that talks to what we've just been talking about?
I'll use the authority of the microphone to tweak your question slightly in my answer. And it just picks up on a kōrero we had just before we came on this morning. Many of you will know one of the forms of knowledge that's just been rediscovered is in the voyaging, using the celestial indicators and using traditional technologies, double hull canoes, to start rediscovering and remembering navigation throughout the Pacific. And the navigators they can get themselves around. You can put them anywhere in the Pacific, blindfolded, and then come tonight and they say, okay, I know where I am, where do you want to go? That's their skill. And so that's the predictive element of the maramataka. Yet within that, they have to deal with the weather that's in front of them. And so I've heard a story where they were training and they said, all the best evidence says, this is where the stars tell us we need to go. We need to keep going this way. This is the good wind. And one of their teachers, Mo Pioluk, who taught many generations of navigators, he said, I think we need to go this way. And he'd seen the signs. He'd seen the tohu of a major storm beyond the horizon before those who had already seen it. And they were like, no, what do you mean? We should be going this way. So he said, okay, let's go your way. Sure enough. And I've heard some of the navigators who were on that, and they were, how do I put it? They were fearful for their lives. Such was the ferocity of the storm. And then afterwards they said, Mo, why did you let us go that way? He said, that's the only way for you to learn. And so I think that the way I'm trying to get to that answer is we have these frameworks that can tell us about predictive things, but we still have to work with what's in front of us. And we still have to try and read those signs on the horizon in order to make those management decisions on the spot.
Okay. I think we're going to get a question from Hema on the floor, and again, I encourage other questions to come in. The other thing I think you mentioned, Rere Atamakia, I said in July, or after Puanga, what's summer going to be like? He said, I'll tell you in August or September. Rings me up, he's in Kaikohe, I'm in Auckland. Rings me up and he goes, did you hear that? And I went, yeah, what? You're in Kaikohe Bay, I'm in Auckland. And he goes, can you hear the shining cuckoo? I said, no. He goes, shining cuckoo's arrived, it's September, normally November, October, long summer, and it's going to be really hot. And then all those guys at Niwa and them said, yeah, long hot summer. Anyway, thought I'd just mention that. Hema.
Kia ora, Dan, for bringing up about the mātauranga, especially the pūrākau and the how it's coded in those kōrero. I was wondering how we could, you talked about the ngā tohu o te rangi me te whenua and te moana. How can we recognise the mana of wahine in that area, because a lot of that narrative is around ngā tāne, and I wonder also about that again, that other perspective about not elevating the role of women, and especially ka moia tāne I nui ngā wahine, and ka puta ngā rākau nui, and so what can we do about that?
He pātai nui tērā I Hema, a tēnā koe, mō tērā. My read is that science was dominated by males, and what's come to happen in places we operate is that has become manifest in other places as well, including with mātauranga. What do we have to do? We just need to keep creating the space and recognising, and in fact using that being a good ancestor analogy, because in order to be a good ancestor there needs to be at least two of us, and one of them needs to be wahine. And for Māori and in many Indigenous peoples, everything's about balance. And so when we get out of balance is when things start to go off track. And so that's he pātai nui tērā. Within the university where I work, we're working really hard to just try and create those opportunities for our mare kore to come through and really, and not just to come through, but to really thrive and blossom. I mean, we could talk for a little bit on that, but I think that's maybe, it's a recognition of the history and why we find ourselves in this space, and then making those new decisions as we move forward. Tēnā koe.
Tēnā koe, hoa tēnā koe i te pātai. He manga mihi nui kia koe. Okay, we've got another one just coming on the virtual platform, and then I think, if that's okay, we might break for morning tea after that, unless there's a real burning question that someone wants to pose before morning tea. This one comes from, is that Ella? Ella from the virtual platform. Tēnā koe, Ella. Thank you for your question. What is the role of oral history and mātauranga Māori when responding to hazards that have not been seen before or are occurring at greater frequency, e.g. coastal hazards exacerbated by ceasing?
Yeah, so there's two parts to this question. The greater frequency one, I mean, that's when we start to think about the way in which hazards have been manifest with respect to climate change and its sea level rise and its increased storm frequency magnitude. You know, in Auckland, we went from too much water, smashed our water supply, to a drought for the next 3 years, to now too much water. And so it's, yet the mātauranga tells us that these are some of the cycles. And in fact, when we start to think about the separation of rangi and papa, one of the deities, Tāwhiri Mātia, had never agreed to this action being taken. And after they were separated, he went out and wrought havoc everywhere before finally coming back to Mātawenga, who's the deity of humans. And only Tū Mātawenga was able to withstand, you know, the onslaught of Tāwhiri Mātia, the deity of winds and weather. And so, you know, ko Poti hau, he was exhausted. And then a framing that we're seeing coming out is that all the ways in which Tāwhiri Mātia impacted tāne in the forests and tangaroa in the oceans are the things that are ramping up now with climate change. So there's a framing for understanding why these things are happening. And why is it? Because suddenly we're out of balance. We're out of reciprocal relationships with Papa Tuanuku. We're not being ways that might lead us to be good ancestors. So that's an understanding for it. How might we use it to better understand? In those areas where we might expect to see increased impacts from sea level rise, from increased tidal flows, from storm setups, it will be where taniwha already manifest. They will be the places where these things will manifest first. And so we need to go and work out where are they, what's going on there. And so those are the ones that have already been seen before, and that greater frequency of them occurring. So, of course, though, for some of them, we won't have seen them. The database is only as good as what it is seen and based on. So it's more about those events or those hazards that are occurring with greater frequency and how mātauranga can tell us where to anticipate they might occur, and then how we might start to understand we can respond to them. And once again, those management decisions based around working with the taiao, not trying to work against the taiao. So kia ora, Ella. Good question.
And I think you might have just answered Rob's question too, actually, about how I can start to get a better appreciation of mātauranga Māori and let it influence by starting, as you say, as some of those oral narratives that already exist and are knowing. I think I'm going to call it there. Is that okay? Sorry to cut it if you had other questions. I'm sure Dan will be appreciative of any approaches that you may have. But for now, we will break for morning tea. It is 10:30 on the dot. We are back here at 11, into plenaries at 11 o'clock. There's a plenary that will happen in here and one that will happen in the next room over here as well. Ka vai, I'll do a quick karakia for our kai for morning tea, and then you can make your way and let the Spirit guide you as you go. Nau mai e ngā hua o te wau nui, o te waitai, o te wai Māori, nā tāne, nā tangaroa, nā haumia tige tūturu whakamaua kia tēnā. Haumia hui e. And bless the hurricanes, amen. Okay, so morning tea just outside over there, and then I'll call you back in just before 11ish for plenaries, okay, and guide you from there. Although I think you know where you're going already, a group of plenaries over there, and some in here as well. Ka pai? Ka pai. Haere, what's it? Lovely, Dan.